What's up, y'all? Welcome to the video. Today we're going to be automating the gameplay for our survival shooter by setting up the enemy manager, which is going to implement the wave logic. The way that we're going to be implementing this is going to include laying out the maximum amount of enemies that we could ever want in the arena at once, and teleporting in the amount of enemies needed for the wave without exceeding the max. When an enemy dies, we're going to teleport it back down, reset it, and bring up the next available enemy if more enemies need to be spawned for that wave. And once you've killed all of the enemies for that wave, we're going to update the wave parameters and begin the next wave. The reason we'll be doing it this way is to prevent us from constantly having to spawn in new enemies, because as you get to higher waves with higher spawn counts, you can possibly tank performance when you're constantly spawning in new actors and destroying them. So we're just going to have our needed enemies spawn all at once and then hide them at the beginning, so that the only thing we need to worry about is updating the location, health, speed, etc. And with all of that being said, let's get right into implementing this. First thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go into our enemy class and we're going to implement our reset method. So what this method is essentially doing is it is teleporting them back to their world location where they spawned in the first place outside of the world, and we are resetting their health to be back to full and setting their combat status to false. Now in order for this to work, we are going to have to replace the destroy call with reset, and in our begin play we're going to set our world location to be where they spawn. Alright, now let's go test that. Let him walk away from where he spawned a little bit. And if we kill him, he is going to reset and go right back to where he was. Now, obviously, he's not going to be in the middle of the arena as his start location, so we're going to change that once we get into spawning our waves. Now let's get into making our enemy manager class. So we're going to create a new C++ class, and we're just going to base this off of an actor. Alright, and once that is loaded, we're going to get into the header file first. So the first thing that we're going to need is a container that's going to hold all of our enemy actors. Next, we're going to need some configurable fields that are going to hold our spawn locations as well as our initial wave spawn count. And we're going to set that to 5 by default, and then we're going to add some new property headers as well so that we can configure them in blueprints. Next, we're going to need a tracker for where our current wave is, and we are going to add a U property to this, but it's only going to be a read-only, and that's so we can track where our current waves are through our HUD UI, so we can get some player feedback and look ourselves what wave we're on. Next, we're going to need some fields for our count and kill trackers. And lastly, in our public section, we're going to need a lot of methods for our spawning and updating enemies. So looking at our methods here, the first thing we're going to need to do is a spawn first wave, and that is just going to spawn the first batch of enemies coming through. And as we're getting ready to spawn our next wave, we're going to update our wave parameters and then spawn that next wave. And as we're killing enemies, if we need to spawn more enemies for that wave, we will be able to call that. If we are tracking to see if the wave needs more enemies killed, we are going to be checking all enemies in combat. So we're going to be checking all enemies that are in the arena, and we'll be taking a look at that, plus the amount of enemies that are needed left in the wave before spawning them. And lastly, we are going to need a method for modifying our wave speed, so making them quicker as we are increasing our waves. And lastly, here we are going to make a private section for some different fields, such as our min and max speeds, as well as the max amount of enemies in the arena that are going to be allowed. Alright, now that should handle everything that we're going to need in our header, so let's get into our CPP file and start implementing this. Right now, looking at our CPP file, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to implement our spawn first wave. So So for our spawn first wave method, first we need to ensure that there are enemies in the list. And once we have done that, we are going to init the spawn count tracker and iterate through all of the enemies. And once we have reached that spawn count, we're going to break it because we have then reached our first wave spawn count. And we're then going to cast the actor from enemies to an enemy. And we're going to temporarily disable collisions so that if they try to spawn on top of one another, they aren't not teleporting. Because if you try to teleport an actor on top of one another, sometimes they just don't teleport. So temporarily disabling collisions, spawning them in, and then enabling collisions usually fixes that issue. And then you're going to set their combat status and update the wave count so that this is working properly right here. Okay, and now that we have our spawn first wave method implemented, we are now going to implement our modify speeds. But first, we're going to need access to enemy movement components. So we're going to add that header up here. It's going to be game framework. All right, now what we're going to want to do for this method is we're just going to iterate through all of the enemies, and we're just going to set a random speed for them based off of the min and maxes. So So again, for what we're doing here for our modifying speeds, we're just iterating through all of our possible enemies in the level, casting them to an enemy, and then we are just getting their movement component and updating their walk speed to be based off of anything in between their min walk speed and the max walk speed. Now before we go and test this, we're going to have to, of course, call it in our begin play method, but we're going to want to initialize some other things first. So we're actually going to go and add an include, and that's going to be our Kismet gameplay statics. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us access to all actors of the enemy class. So that is what we're going to get first, and then we're going to store it in our enemy list. So what this call is doing exactly is getting the world context object. It is getting the static class of our enemy, and it is then storing all actors that it can find in the world of this class in enemies. So last thing we're going to want to do in our begin play is we're going to want to call our spawn method. And in that, we're also going to modify their speeds after we spawn them. So we're actually going to add a delay to this, and that's just going to be like about 3 seconds, just to give the player some breathing room before combat actually begins. So we're going to do it this way. So again, what we're doing here is we're adding a slight delay to the spawning of our first wave, and we're doing it by getting the world's time manager and setting the timer to do this task right here in like 3 seconds. And then after we spawn that first wave, we are going to modify their speeds so that it is going to be this default max and min. And once you have that compiled, we are now going to go back into Unreal, and we're going to actually make this a blueprint version of our enemy manager, and we're going to start setting it up at our level. So let's call this BP enemy manager and store it in our blueprints. Actually, we'll put it in our AI. Alright, and once we have this, we're now actually going to go and add our spawn location. So we're going to have 4 in here. And we're just going to go around the map and getting some different locations that the player isn't going to have access to later, but it's going to be somewhere where we can teleport in our enemies without the player seeing, and then spawning in those enemies for them to walk around the corner. So real quick, we're just going to go and set those locations. Okay, and once you have your spawn location set, the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to add a bunch of our enemies, and we're going to store them outside of our nav mesh so that they're disabled, and then once we teleport them back into our level, they'll be re-enabled and can start doing their actions. So we're going to delete this real quick, and we're going to go under our level, under where the nav mesh is, and we're going to get like a platform like this, and we're going to drag out some enemies. Okay, that should be good. Now, let's test this. Give it like 3 seconds and we'll see where the enemies spawn. And now we have one of them. And looks like he disappeared back under the arena. If we press F8 here, we can verify that. And it looks like he is. So F8. Alright, and that is our first wave fully functional. Okay, now that we have our spawn first wave working and we have our enemies resetting properly, we're now going to go back into our code and we're going to update some, and we're going to implement some more methods so that we can start spawning in more waves. Okay, back in our enemy manager. Now before we go into implementing our start next wave, we're going to want to be able to update our wave parameters. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to reset our wave kills and turn them to 0, and then we're also going to add our current wave. So what we're doing here is we are increasing our current wave size. So before we start our next wave, we're going to increase the amount of total kills that the wave is going to need before starting the next wave. And we're also going to increase the amount of enemies that we can have in the arena at once. However, we are also going to be capping this to be a little bit less than the maximum amount of enemies in the level, and this is to help prevent a possible index out of bounds error. And we're just going to do -2 just to be safe. Now the last thing that we're going to update in this method is going to be our max and min walk speeds. So as the waves go on, they're going to be getting faster, and so we're going to update those here and also cap them off so they're not going at insane speeds. And the max for that is going to be 400, and the max for our minimum walk speed is going to be 350, so we're going to indicate that down here. Okay, and that should be good for updating our different wave parameters. Now we can get into implementing our start next wave. So getting into this is going to be very similar to our spawn first wave, but rather than looking at our first wave spawn count, we're now going to be looking at this current wave size. And before we get into this, I realized that we did not initialize this at the beginning. So we're actually going to go down into begin play, and I'm going to set this to what our first spawn count is. Okay, now in here, okay, so looking at this method, so yep, we are iterating through our enemies. If we have reached the maximum amount of enemies in the arena, we're going to break, or if we have spawned the full wave, we're going to break. Now, this is pretty much the same as the spawn first wave, however, if any of the enemies are in combat, then they're already in the arena and we're not going to spawn them. Now, if this is just the start of the next wave, this is very, very likely not going to happen, but it's just a failsafe in case something wacky happens down the road. And then once we have spawned all of them, we're going to modify our wave speeds. Now for our enemy manager, we only have 2 more methods to implement, and we're going to start with our get all enemies in combat, since our spawn more enemies actually uses this to check if spawning more enemies is necessary. So first let's do this. Okay, so what we are doing here is we are making an empty list of possible enemies in combat. We're going to iterate through all of our enemies, cast it to an enemy, check if it's in combat, and if it is in combat, we're going to add that actor to this list up here and then return that list. And now, before we spawn more enemies, we're actually going to check if it is necessary to spawn them. So we're going to make those checks, and then if it is necessary to spawn them, we're just going to spawn another enemy. So in here, we are first getting the amount of needed enemies that we need to kill in order to complete the wave, and if that is greater than 0, then we'll proceed. And then we take into account the amount of enemies that are currently in the arena and compare them to our needed kills, and if that is satisfactory, then we're going to check that the arena isn't full, and if all of that is true, then we're going to iterate through our enemies, find the next enemy that isn't in combat, spawn them, and then break the loop. And then that should be good to go. Now, since all of these functions are now implemented, we now need to connect this to the enemy, and once we kill our enemies, we need to update the manager so that we can actually have this be a little bit more automated, and we can start calling our spawn more enemies, our start next wave, and whatnot. So let's get into that. Okay, now back in our enemy header file, we are now going to go and include our enemy manager header. And we're going to come down here and make a private section. And we're going to make a reference to our enemy manager so that our enemies, once they die, we can now have a reference to that global manager, and we can then update it based on the kill. Okay, and once you have that all set in your header, come back into the CPP, and we're going to actually set that enemy manager to be whatever it is in the level. So we're going to get an actor from our statics for that. So So again, this is just getting a reference to the enemy manager through the static class of the manager. And once you have that, the last thing we're going to want to do is, in here, while we're resetting our enemies, we're also going to want to make sure that we're updating the manager. So So in here, once we reset or kill an enemy, we're going to update the manager with the next wave kills. And if they've reached the amount of wave kills needed to end the wave, then we're going to update our wave parameters and then we're going to start the next wave. But if there are kills that are needed in this wave, we're then just going to spawn more enemies. And that should be everything we need to be able to have our waves advance. So we're going to go back into Unreal and test all of this. And we're going to go around and find our enemies. Alright, I believe that was 5, so that should now spawn the next wave and make them a little bit quicker. Seems they're slightly quicker, so that is working. Alright, now it looks like that was probably it, so it should spawn the next enemy wave. And it looks like they are much faster now. Alright, so it looks like our wave logic is working and we are advancing. However, if you noticed in our HUD UI, the wave count isn't updating when we're updating the waves, or our wave count isn't updating as we're advancing through. So we're going to go back and make a binding for that real quick in our blueprint. So if we come right over here into this right here where we have a 1, we're going to go and create a new binding. And we're going to name this Get Current Wave. Now for this, it's going to be similar to the rest of them, except we're going to get an actor of class and then look for our enemy manager. And we're just going to call upon our enemy manager class. Going to get our current wave, and then we're going to turn that into text and then return that. Alright, compile, save that, and if we go back and test now, still be 1. And there we go. It looks like wave 2 is there. Now let's see if we can beat wave 2 and get onto wave 3 and make sure that's working fine. Alright, and it seems that is working. Alrighty, now that is going to cover everything for this video. We now have our wave logic implemented and have automated our gameplay to spawn enemies and increase the difficulty as the player progresses. In the next video, we're going to implement our point system and add in an ammo station object for us to refill our ammo mid-game. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It really does help out the channel and I appreciate it. I'll see y'all in the next video.